After the fall of the Third Reich, the world thought that Nazi ideology had been buried beneath the rubble of Berlin. But in the 1950s, in the very heart of the United States, a new face emerged to revive that hatred, dressed in American clothes and speaking in a patriotic accent. His name, George Lincoln Rockwell, war veteran, charismatic speaker, and founder of the American Nazi Party. He idolized Hitler, denied the Holocaust, and dreamed of a unified white nation under the swastika. Today, those seeds have sprouted in unexpected corners of the world, from far-right rallies in Europe to battalions in Ukraine that proudly wear SS insignia. The legacy of Nazism drags on like a persistent shadow. But why, after the horror of the Second World War, did neo-Nazi movements arise in the middle of the 20th century? The fall of the Führer and total denazification. Germany, May 1945. The Reich had fallen, the ruins of Berlin still smoked, and the echo of the bombs mixed with a disconcerting silence. The flags of the Third Reich had been torn down from every corner, and the face of the Führer, omnipresent for more than a decade, had disappeared as if it had never existed. Amid that desolate landscape, social bonds were also breaking. With much of the male population dead or in captivity, in some neighborhoods there was only one young German man for every 6 women. Scenes of Allied soldiers, especially Americans, flirting with local girls began to multiply. For the few young Germans returning from the front, these images were yet another humiliation. "We spent 6 years risking our lives," they said bitterly, "and now they're running after the Americans as if we had never been here." Denazification in post-war Germany turned out to be a long and complex process. At the end of the conflict, the National Socialist Party had more than 8 million members, which posed enormous challenges for the Allies. In the zones under Western control, the authorities opted to implement an extensive system of social cleansing. To that end, more than 16 million forms known as Fragebogen were distributed, an extensive 12-page questionnaire composed of 133 questions that each citizen had to complete, detailing their degree of involvement with the Nazi regime. The answers allowed individuals to be classified into 5 categories, from major culpability to exonerated, passing through intermediate grades like committed or sympathizer. This classification not only determined access to public jobs or administrative positions, but also to rationing and welfare systems. However, a clear problem soon emerged. A large portion of those who held key functions in civil administration, justice, and education had been connected in some way to Nazism. Carrying out a total purge meant in many cases paralyzing entire sectors of the state. Likewise, at the beginning of the Allied occupation, the authorities imposed strict measures to eradicate any trace of National Socialism in German public life. Among them, the absolute prohibition of displaying Nazi symbols, such as the swastika or the outstretched arm salute, which was categorically banned. This regulation, still in force today, is often ignored by foreign tourists who, unaware of its legal gravity, imitate the gesture in historical areas, leading to numerous arrests each year. With the aim of confronting the population with the reality of the regime that had ruled the country, screenings were organized of documentaries such as Die Todesmühlen or Welt im Filmnummer 5, which showed images of the concentration camps. However, part of the audience would turn their faces away in rejection or denial, evidencing the difficulty of facing the recent past. In some cases, like in the Ettersberg concentration camp, residents of nearby cities such as Weimar were forced to walk through the grounds where the stacked bodies of the victims still lay. The pedagogy of guilt also extended to the urban space. The streets of various cities were covered with posters showing photographs of the horrors committed in the camps, accompanied by direct phrases such as, "These atrocities, your fault." It was an attempt to morally link the entire German society with the consequences of the regime that many had supported or at least silently tolerated. Punishment was not enough. After the fall of the Third Reich, the Allies understood that to rebuild Germany, it was not enough to judge the guilty. It was necessary to profoundly transform the mentality of an entire society. After 12 years of totalitarian propaganda, fiery speeches, and ideological education from early childhood, The German people had to be re-educated in democratic values, tolerance, and critical thinking. Military defeat alone did not guarantee that change. The challenge was immense. The youngest citizens, educated entirely under the Nazi regime, were those who showed the greatest resistance to the new order. For many of them, the previous world, marked by discipline, nationalism, and the messianic figure of the Führer, was the only reality they had known. The opening to new forms of thought, such as modern art or liberal ideas, generated visceral reactions, often of open hostility. The seed of an authoritarian mentality still beat strongly in the younger generations. Faced with this, the Allies promoted deep reforms in the education system and the media. It was imperative to dismantle the cultural and symbolic foundations of Nazism and replace them with democratic principles. School content was revised, textbooks were changed, new artistic and literary movements were promoted, and every expression exalting militarism or racial superiority was banned. George Lincoln Rockwell, the Führer of the New World. After the fall of the Third Reich, many believed that Nazism had been eradicated forever. However, by the late 1950s, a former U.S. Navy officer named George Lincoln Rockwell would resurrect this ideology on American soil. A World War II veteran and former philosophy student at Brown University, Rockwell began adopting fascist ideas during his military service. While stationed in Iceland during the Korean War, he became obsessed with Nazi propaganda, including Mein Kampf and the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This exposure, combined with the anti-communist climate in the United States and influences from figures like Henry Ford and Charles Lindbergh, further radicalized him. Born in Illinois in 1918, Rockwell had a turbulent childhood. His parents, vaudeville performers, divorced when he was 6 years old. He spent his youth divided between New Jersey and Maine. His father, known by the nickname Doc, was a well-known vaudeville actor of English and Scottish descent, while his mother was a talented dancer with French and German roots. His father hoped his son would attend a prestigious university and pushed him to apply to Harvard. Although his grades had improved at his second high school, they were still inconsistent, so to strengthen his application, Rockwell decided to take an additional semester at Hope High School. There, he earned a new high school diploma, but Harvard ultimately rejected him because some academic documents never arrived due to an administrative error. Since he had bet everything on that single option and didn't apply to other universities, his father enrolled him in Hebron Academy in Maine to avoid losing the academic year. In 1938, Rockwell entered Brown University in Rhode Island to study philosophy. His grades were not outstanding and were below the university's usual standards, but he was admitted thanks to a high aptitude test score. On campus, he became the art editor and cartoonist for the student magazine Sir Brown, where he satirically expressed his ideological critiques against other students. Over time, he began to show an increasingly dark view of humanity and society, and often clashed with his sociology professor over his rejection of egalitarian ideas. One of his essays on criminality nearly got him expelled. Ultimately, during his second academic year, he decided to leave his studies and accepted a position as an officer in the United States Navy. He served in both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters during World War II as a transport and reconnaissance pilot. After the war, he alternated between commercial art jobs and family life while remaining in the reserves. By the early 1950s, his marriage had collapsed and his worldview had taken an extremist turn. In December 1954, his active duty ended and Rockwell was transferred to the reserves, after which he returned to the US with Thora and their children. In an attempt to support his family, he tried various professional paths, including freelance writing, managing to sell some articles, though he received many more rejections. He also ventured into invention. He founded US Lady, a magazine aimed at the wives of US military personnel. Although at times it was relatively profitable and achieved wide distribution, the magazine was distributed for free, and Rockwell eventually had disputes with his business partners, prompting him to sell the publication in 1956. Later, he worked briefly as an independent contractor for National Review magazine. Between 1957 and 1958, Rockwell had a series of dreams that always ended with an encounter with Hitler, which motivated him to make his ideology public. In 1958, he met Harold Noel Arrowsmith Jr., a wealthy and anti-Semitic heir, who provided him with a house and printing equipment. Together, they formed the National Committee to Free America from Jewish Domination. That same year, Rockwell helped found a racist political party in Georgia called the National States' Rights Party. He offered them advice, and the committee he had created supplied them with materials. On July 29, 1958, George Lincoln Rockwell organized a demonstration in front of the White House to protest President Eisenhower's decision to send troops to the Middle East in the so-called Operation Blue Bat. He and his followers argued that this action was a result of supposed Jewish influence within the U.S. government. Later, in October of that same year, after the bombing of the Hebrew Benevolent Temple, the media initially linked him to the crime. Although the FBI investigated him, they found no conclusive evidence. Nevertheless, Rockwell was publicly identified as a Nazi sympathizer, and police searched his house the day after the attack. Throughout 1959, after his separation, Rockwell tried to win back Thora, his ex-wife, but her family strongly opposed it. During that year, he fell into heavy alcohol consumption. In December, he sold all his belongings to travel unexpectedly to Iceland in hopes of winning her back. He promised that he would completely renounce his political activities if she took him back. According to his collaborator James K. Warner, if Thora had accepted, Rockwell would have abandoned the Nazi movement. However, the trip was controlled by her family and Thora rejected him. Rockwell returned to the United States, never having seen his wife or children again. Emotionally devastated, he confessed to his mother that he had lost all purpose in life and mentioned suicidal thoughts. Nevertheless, after that episode, his writings and statements began to reflect a renewed ideological fanaticism, more vehement than before. The following year, he officially founded the American Nazi Party from his home in Arlington, Virginia, publicly adopting Nazi uniforms, swastikas, and a rhetoric inspired by Hitler. Rockwell called himself the American Hitler and began organizing rallies, publishing anti-Semitic pamphlets, and spreading his ideology through magazines like Stormtrooper magazine. He drew attention through provocative actions, such as protesting against the film Exodus, or attempting to celebrate Hitler's birthday alongside British neo-Nazis. Although he always remained on the margins of politics, his figure grew symbolically within the American far right. Rockwell mastered the art of attracting attention through political actions designed to cause controversy. His main goal was to attract as much media attention as possible, and to achieve that, he intentionally provoked certain sectors of society, especially the Jewish community. He used these negative reactions as fuel to increase the visibility of his cause, also taking advantage of the social climate generated by the civil rights movement in the United States. As a countermeasure, Jewish organizations in the U.S. devised a media isolation strategy to prevent Rockwell from gaining notoriety. This tactic, already used in the past against figures like Gerald L.K. Smith, was developed by S. Andhill Feinberg of the American Jewish Committee. His plan involved keeping Rockwell away from three key audiences: Jews, the general public, and anti-Semitism sympathizers, each with a specific approach. He recommended responding to his provocations with indifference. However, within the American Nazi Party, some like Matt Koehl claimed that there was a larger economic conspiracy, though no evidence was ever found. Moreover, attempts to isolate him were not always effective. Seeking media impact, Rockwell tried to organize a rally in Union Square in July 1960, knowing it would provoke controversy. Although some groups like the ACLU and the ADL defended his constitutional right to protest, New York authorities denied him a permit due to the risk of riots. Shortly thereafter, he clashed with Jewish veterans, was arrested, and declared mentally unfit for trial, leading to his confinement in a psychiatric hospital. This episode led him to write a pamphlet explaining how to appear sane to avoid involuntary commitment. In 1961, he published his autobiography, This Time the World, and the following year he took part in a neo-Nazi camp in England alongside British figure Colin Jordan, where they founded the World Union of National Socialists. Later, he awarded a medal to a member of his group for physically attacking Martin Luther King Jr. Between 1964 and 1966, George Lincoln Rockwell experienced the peak of his notoriety. Although the number of active members in the American Nazi Party remained small, His constant demonstrations, provocations, and public acts kept him in the media spotlight. However, Rockwell was not seeking fame for its own sake, but rather intended to use it as a springboard to real political power, something he never achieved. Realizing that provocation only kept him on the fringe of the system, he began to design a more structured and long-term strategy to expand his influence. Rockwell believed that the political ineffectiveness of his movement was due, in part, to the ineptitude of his followers. He thought many of them did not understand the fundamentals of National Socialism and were not up to his standards. Only a few, such as Matt Curl, met his criteria. To attract more capable members, he created a front organization called the United White Christian Majority and tried to relaunch a youth group called the White Youth Corps, although both attempts failed. Only 2 party delegations in Texas and Southern California showed some real growth during this period. Nevertheless, those years attracted a key figure, William Luther Pierce, who joined the movement in 1965 and became one of Rockwell's main collaborators. By 1966, Rockwell launched new publications such as the National Socialist World magazine, edited by Pierce himself, intending to offer a more refined and systematic ideological vision. That same year, Rockwell led a protest against Martin Luther King Jr. in Cicero, Illinois, in defense of racial segregation. Additionally, in response to the Black Power slogan of the civil rights movement, he coined the term white power, which became one of the most recognized slogans of his supremacist movement. John Patler, of Greek origin, was one of George Lincoln Rockwell's closest members and the editor of the Stormtrooper magazine. Although his ancestry caused friction within the American Nazi Party, Rockwell defended him by promoting a broader vision of white supremacy, which divided the party into 2 factions, the traditionalist Aryan Unity led by Matt Curl and the more inclusive White Power faction led by Rockwell. In 1967, Rockwell attempted to Americanize the movement. He changed the party's name, logo, and slogan, and drafted new ideological principles. These changes, largely pushed by Patler, triggered further internal tensions until Patler was expelled. In response, he began sending letters alternating between hatred and pleas for reconciliation, revealing an emotionally unstable relationship with Rockwell. That same year, Rockwell survived an assassination attempt and unsuccessfully requested a permit to carry firearms. Amid this tense atmosphere, his partner Barbara von Goetz gave birth to their daughter Gretchen, who died a few months later from a genetic disease, just like a previous daughter. This new personal blow deeply affected Rockwell. The relationship with Patler ended in tragedy. On August 25, 1967, Patler murdered him with a gunshot in Arlington, Virginia. The crime marked the final chapter of a story defined by betrayal, radicalization, and a spiral of hatred that ultimately destroyed the very leader of American Nazism. Almost 2 months after the failed assassination attempt, on August 25, 1967, George Lincoln Rockwell was gunned down by John Patler, former member of his own movement, as he exited a laundromat in Arlington, Virginia, very close to the headquarters of his organization. After entering the building claiming he had forgotten something, Rockwell returned to his car. At that moment, 2 shots were fired. The first missed him, but the second struck him in the chest. Although he attempted to get out of the vehicle, he collapsed on the sidewalk, dying at 12:02 p.m. Local police arrested Patler shortly thereafter, just a few kilometers from the crime scene. Prosecutors argued that the motive was retaliation for his expulsion from the party. It was also speculated that Patler acted out of frustration over Rockwell's lack of support in the face of attacks regarding his ethnic origin, especially from leaders like Cole and Pierce. However, biographer Frederick J. Simonelli dismissed this theory, stating that Rockwell had supported him. Another hypothesis pointed to an alleged affair between Rockwell and Patler's wife, although this version was never presented at trial, and Patler even expressed his acceptance of it in a letter. It was also suggested that Patler was responsible for the attempted assassination that occurred in June of that same year. Patler denied the charges, and his defense attempted to shift the blame toward Curl, insinuating that he would benefit from Rockwell's disappearance. Some members, such as Carl Allen, questioned Patler's guilt and created a legal defense fund, alleging a conspiracy orchestrated by the Anti-Defamation League. Although most of the party believed in Patler's guilt, certain sectors suspected an internal betrayal. Rockwell's personal bodyguard, Francis Joseph Smith, after conducting his own investigation, accused Cale, Pierce, and Lloyd of having plotted the assassination, identifying Christopher Vidnjevich as the true perpetrator of the crime. This later led to a shootout between Smith and Vidnjevich, from which both survived. Ultimately, Patler was sentenced to 20 years in prison for the murder. Although he appealed and was released on bail, the Virginia Supreme Court upheld his conviction in 1970, forcing him to return to prison. His case was later dismissed by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1972. He was released on parole in 1975, but after violating the terms a year later, he was imprisoned again for 6 more years until he completed his full sentence. After Rockwell's body was released following the autopsy, a dispute broke out between his family and Matt Coel, who was second in command of the National Socialist White People's Party. While the family sought a private ceremony in Southport Island, Maine, Coel planned a high-profile, propaganda-laced funeral for the organization. He even proposed burying Rockwell in Arlington National Cemetery dressed in his Nazi uniform, which deeply outraged Rockwell's brother Bobby, who called the plans a repulsive circus orchestrated by idiots. Bobby took legal action to regain control of the body, but Coel, invoking Rockwell's will, tried to assert his rights. In an intimidating gesture, Coel threatened to surround Rockwell's mother's home, located in a Jewish neighborhood, with Nazi militants. Ultimately, the family gave up their efforts and publicly announced they would not attend the burial. The federal government authorized Rockwell's burial at Culpeper National Cemetery, given his status as a veteran with an honorable discharge. Certain conditions were imposed. Nazi symbols and an all-white honor guard were prohibited, although he was allowed to be buried in his Nazi uniform. The funeral took place on August 29th and was accompanied by a procession of uniformed followers. Upon arrival, state and military security forces blocked access to the cemetery. An official explained the conditions to Coel and asked his men to remove their swastikas, but they refused. The standoff lasted for hours, and amid the chaos, a train nearly struck one of the cortege vehicles. A soldier who defected to the Nazi side was arrested, which sparked a series of clashes with military police and several arrests. The next day, Coel decided to cremate Rockwell's body in secret, thereby avoiding any public ceremony. Rockwell frequently praised Adolf Hitler, referring to him as the white savior of the 20th century. He denied the Holocaust and believed that Martin Luther King Jr. was a tool used by Jewish communists to dominate the white population. In an interview for Playboy with Alex Haley, Rockwell stated, "I emphatically deny that there is any valid proof that the Nazis systematically murdered innocent Jews." He also attributed the civil rights movement to Jewish influence and viewed most Jews as disloyal. He considered the African American population to be part of a backward group and proposed their relocation to a new African state funded by the United States government. His views distanced him from his family and social circle. His brother's business and personal life were severely affected by his association with Rockwell, and friends and family began to drift away, shocked by his behavior. Many believed that his radicalization could be due to mental health issues. His own father attempted several times to persuade him to abandon his ideas, without success, which only led to bitter arguments between them. Rockwell had practically no contact with his ex-wives or children, limiting regular communication only to his mother and sister. His final book, White Power, was published shortly after his death. This work, rather than a defense of classic Nazism, leans toward a broader vision of white supremacy, discarding old Nazi discriminations that even targeted certain European groups, such as Slavs. The text uses very direct and harsh language to promote his ideological vision, blaming certain groups for fostering racial divisions in the United States and presenting the racial conflict as a growing threat. The book seeks to motivate followers of his ideas to unite and act, and has been described by some scholars as a call to action. George Lincoln Rockwell is considered by many to be the pioneer of neo-Nazism in the United States. Although his name remains relatively unknown to the general public, his influence on the most radical sectors of the far right has been profound and lasting. His greatest legacy was the White Power movement, which redefined the concept of white supremacy by opening the door to any non-Jewish white person. eliminating the old restrictions of Nordic origin or religious belief. Through this vision, Rockwell planted the seed of an ideology that would continue branching out long after his death. The echo of the swastika, the resurgence of Nazism in the United Kingdom. In the United Kingdom, prominent figures also emerged within the neo-Nazi movement, openly embracing the doctrines and aesthetics of the Third Reich. One of the most notable was Colin Jordan, who led groups such as the National Socialist Movement and the World Union of National Socialists. Jordan promoted a vision of Nazism as a global pan-Aryan ideology directly inspired by the ideas of Adolf Hitler and adapted to the British context. Colin Jordan, son of Percy Jordan, an academic, and Bertha Jordan, a teacher, received his education at Warwick School between 1934 and 1942. During World War II, he attempted to join the Fleet Air Arm and the Royal Air Force, but failed the examinations. He ultimately enlisted in the Educational Corps of the British Army. After being discharged in 1946, he studied at Sydney Sussex College, University of Cambridge, where he earned a degree in history in 1949 with second-class honours. That same year, he began working as a mathematics teacher at Stoke Secondary Modern Boys' School in Coventry. In 1953, he received a Master of Arts MA degree. Shortly afterward, he joined the League of Empire Loyalists, a nationalist organisation, where he served as regional coordinator for the Midlands. In 1962, Colin Jordan founded a new National Socialist-style organisation, the National Socialist Movement, which would later be renamed the British Movement in 1968. Alongside John Tyndall as a prominent figure, they began gaining attention through public acts such as the rally at Trafalgar Square on July 2nd of that year, which ended in riots when they were confronted by opponents. As a result, Jordan was dismissed from his teaching position in Coventry after a temporary suspension stemming from these events. That same year, Jordan organised an international summit of extremists in Gloucestershire, which led to the founding of the World Union of National Socialists. He was named leader of the European wing and held the title of World Führer, with George Lincoln Rockwell, leader of the American Nazi movement, as his second-in-command. However, Jordan and his collaborators were arrested for attempting to form a paramilitary organisation called Spearhead, inspired by the Nazi SA. After being observed training by undercover police, Jordan was sentenced to 9 months in prison in October 1962. Following his release in a controversial event, Jordan married Françoise Dior in 1963, the niece of the famous French designer and former fiancé of Tyndall, who was still in prison at the time. The marriage, which appeared to be aimed at avoiding her deportation, led to a definitive split between the two leaders. Dior announced the separation just a few months later in 1964, although the divorce was not formalized until 1967. During the Leighton by-election in 1965, Jordan led a provocative protest at a Labour Party event and ended up being punched by then-Defence Minister Denis Healey. This strategy of public confrontation was nothing new. In 1964, Jordan had supported racist campaigns such as the one in Smethwick, promoting openly xenophobic slogans against mainstream parties. These actions culminated in his 1967 conviction to 18 months in prison for inciting racial hatred through pamphlets such as the Coloured Invasion. In 1972, he caused another scandal when he was fined for inciting a strike at Heathrow Airport in protest of the arrival of Asian immigrants from Uganda. Already in decline, he reorganized his movement in 1968, but in 1974 he was replaced as leader by Michael McLaughlin. His public career was completely discredited after he was arrested in 1975 for stealing women's underwear from a supermarket, a crime for which he received a fine. Thus ended the public life of one of the most visible neo-Nazis in 20th century Britain. The Grey Division, neo-Nazism in Ukraine's trenches. Andriy Beletsky is one of the most recognized figures of radical nationalism in contemporary Ukraine. He was the founder and first commander of the Azov Battalion, a volunteer militia formed in 2014, known both for its military effectiveness and its ultra-nationalist symbolism. Beletsky also promoted the creation of the Social National Assembly, an ideological platform that advocated extreme positions within the context of Ukraine's political turmoil. He later led the National Core Party, and held a seat in parliament from 2014 to 2019. Ukraine, amid armed conflict and political instability, has not been exempt from the resurgence of extremist movements. In recent years, leaders and groups with clear neo-Nazi affinities have emerged, gaining media presence and even political representation. Andrei Beletsky was born in 1979 in the city of Kharkiv, in the former Soviet Union. His family had deep national roots. On his father's side, he descended from Cossacks who founded a village in the Kharkiv region, and on his mother's side from a noble lineage tied to 19th-century Ukrainian revolutionary movements. From a young age, he displayed a rebellious and patriotic character. He refused to join Soviet youth organizations and, along with other students, once raised the Ukrainian flag at his school as a symbolic gesture of independence. One of the books that marked his childhood was a banned historical work about Ukraine under the Soviet regime. During the Kosovo War, he attempted unsuccessfully to join the Yugoslav army as a volunteer to fight the KLA. In 2001, he graduated with a degree in history from Kharkiv University, with a thesis focused on Ukrainian armed movements. That same year, he took part in protests against the government, was arrested and flagged by state security services. In 2002, Andrei Beletsky assumed leadership of the Kharkiv division of the nationalist organization Trizub. Simultaneously, he was an active member of the local delegation of the Social National Party of Ukraine, although he rejected its later transformation into the Svoboda Party, openly opposing that ideological shift. After the Social National Party's reformation and the dissolution of the original Patriot of Ukraine group, Beletsky undertook its reorganization in 2005 as a fully autonomous entity, disconnected from any political party. This new version was largely made up of former members of nationalist groups, such as Una Uenso, Trizub, and former members of the Social National Party of Ukraine, particularly in the Kharkiv region. That same year, Beletsky also began collaborating with the newly created Ukrainian Conservative Party. In the 2006 parliamentary elections, he attempted to win a seat in the Ukrainian parliament, but failed to gather enough votes to enter the Verkhovna Rada. During the Euromaidan protests, members of the Patriot of Ukraine organization led by Beletsky took part in the formation of the ultranationalist Right Sector movement on November 28, 2013. On February 24, 2014, the Ukrainian parliament passed a resolution to release political prisoners, and the next day, Beletsky was acquitted of all charges and released along with other activists. Shortly afterward, on March 12th, he assumed command of special operations for the Right Sector in eastern Ukraine, covering regions such as Poltava, Kharkiv, Donetsk, and Luhansk. On May 5th of that year, in the city of Berdyansk, he founded the Azov Battalion and became its first commander. This paramilitary group consisted of members of his movement, radical football hooligans, and activists from the Euromaidan movement. Over time, the battalion was formalized as part of the National Guard of Ukraine on November 20, 2014, gaining notoriety, and the nickname Little Black Men, a reference to their Russian counterparts. On June 13th, Beletsky led his men in the First Battle of Mariupol, considered a key tactical victory. According to British journalist Askold Krushelnicki, his behavior in combat was calm and strategic. In recognition, on August 2nd, he was awarded the Order of Valor, 3rd class, and shortly thereafter, on August 15th, he was promoted to the rank of lieutenant colonel in the Ukrainian police. It was at this point that the Azov Battalion began to forge its reputation as a feared and highly effective unit on the battlefield. However, its notoriety was not only due to military performance, it also attracted attention and generated controversy due to the ideologies of some of its early members and the symbols they used. Several of its founders came from ultranationalist and far-right movements, raising concerns both within and outside Ukraine. One of the most controversial emblems associated with the battalion was the wolf's angel, or wolf hook. This symbol, resembling a Z-shaped hook, has roots in Germanic heraldry, but was adopted during World War II by certain Nazi Waffen-SS units, giving it a disturbing symbolic weight in the modern context. This did not go unnoticed, although the Azov Battalion has repeatedly claimed that the wolf's angel represents for them a fighting spirit and is associated with the letters N and I. short for national idea, its resemblance to Nazi iconography has sparked major controversy. Another controversial symbol that appeared was the Black Sun, a solar wheel associated with Nazi Germany. Images of some early members performing Nazi salutes or posing with swastika flags did little to dispel rumors of ideological leanings. Additionally, in the early stages of the conflict, the unit attracted foreign volunteers with neo-Nazi sympathies, further reinforcing the perception that Azov was linked to extremist movements. Despite the scandal, the Ukrainian government could not ignore the battalion's effectiveness. By late 2014, Azov was officially integrated into the National Guard of Ukraine, becoming a regular military unit with a more professional and controlled structure. Over time, the Azov battalion evolved and was reorganized into the Azov Regiment, increasing both in size and operational capacity. By 2021, facing growing demands for a more solid military structure, the unit was elevated to the status of a brigade, reflecting its consolidation within the Ukrainian army. This marked a turning point in its history. During this process, Azov became one of the largest and best-equipped formations in Ukraine's armed forces. Furthermore, the gradual incorporation of new recruits, many of whom did not share the radical ideologies of the founders, helped to somewhat soften the group's controversial image, distancing it from the extremist symbolism it had once embraced. Despite the controversies it carried from its origins, the Azov battalion was officially integrated into the Ukrainian army in 2014. This incorporation came with a profound transformation. Members were banned from participating in political activities, leading to the departure of several founding members, including Andriy Beletsky, who later founded the far-right National Corps Party. Over time, the link between the military regiment and the political movements that stemmed from it gradually faded. As the regiment professionalized within official military structures, the National Corps and other parallel organizations formed by former members continued on separate paths, engaging in acts and speeches that fueled their radical reputation, but without direct ties to the new military structure of Azov. As of 2022, the Azov regiment operated under the direct command of the Ukrainian state, and its ranks reflected an ethnic diversity unthinkable in its founding stage. Its name endured, but its original ideological ties were, officially, a thing of the past. Why neo-Nazism never regained a foothold in Germany? After the end of World War II, National Socialism did not significantly redevelop in Germany, but instead found new spaces in contexts far removed from its place of origin. Even during the war, Hitler had urged the populations of Western Europe under occupation to join his fight against communism, which fueled intense ideological propaganda in Germanic cultural regions. Over time, this doctrine was adopted in other parts of the world, especially in countries with a majority of European descent, such as the United States, Argentina, or South Africa. In each of these places, Nazism was reinterpreted through different local and ethnic realities. However, one aspect of its ideology remained almost intact: anti-Semitism rooted in pseudo-scientific theories based on genetics. The third wave, linked to the National Socialist ideology, emerged from what is known as the New Right. This movement disguises its European-rooted racism under an ethno-cultural discourse, essentially reproducing the same ideology with a renewed appearance. The New Right originated in France in the late 1960s, presenting itself as a cultural current with the explicit intent to establish a counterpower against Marxist thought and leftist hegemony, promoting the formation of new intellectual elites and leadership. Ultimately, the pernicious legacy of German philosophical and political tradition has become evident in the fourth generation of National Socialism, the Skin Nazis. This current, considered the most aggressive since World War II, seeks to realize the ideal of a neo-Nazi pan-Europeanism through direct action. The skinhead phenomenon emerged in the United Kingdom in the late 1960s, particularly in working-class neighborhoods of cities such as London, East End, and Manchester. The youths who made up this movement were distinguished by their appearance: shaved heads, tight trousers, collarless shirts, suspenders, military boots with steel toes, Doc Martens, designed both for defense and aggression, and bomber jackets. This new youth subculture broke away from previous styles such as rockers or mods, adopting a tough aesthetic that sought to proudly reclaim their working-class roots through a visual reinterpretation of the traditional laboring class. The skinhead subculture formed through an unusual fusion of two seemingly opposing currents: the rude boys, Afro-Caribbean youths, especially Jamaicans with a strong sense of identity, and white British working-class youth. From the Jamaicans, skinheads adopted elements of street slang, dress style, including shaved heads, musical tastes, and even a peculiar alliance between white and Jamaican African youths against the Pakistani community, which led to frequent clashes with immigrants from that background. This cultural combination manifested in the emergence of ska, a musical genre that blended rock and reggae, and which evolved in the late 1970s under the influence of punk into what became known as Oi music. This new style, considered by its followers as street punk, maintained a sound similar to traditional punk, and many of its songs were performed in settings filled with alcohol and collective euphoria. Until the early 1980s, the skinhead culture remained mostly distant from clear political positions. However, during the 1970s, a significant transformation occurred within this subculture. The initial alliance between British and Jamaican youths collapsed, and by 1972, attacks by skinhead groups against African youths began to be recorded. Although tensions already existed, it was in the 1980s that the movement's politicization intensified, especially in football stadiums, under the growing influence of the British neo-fascist party, the National Front. The National Front resonated with many skinheads and radical football fans known as hooligans through its newspaper Bulldog, which from 1980 provided space for supporters of various British clubs to openly boast about their racist acts. This link between hooligans, skinheads, and local representatives of the National Front quickly solidified. In parallel, the British movement replicated this strategy with its publication The Phoenix, aiming to attract the same sectors. A key figure in this fusion of music, youth, and far-right politics was the band Screwdriver, led by Ian Stewart Donaldson. Supported by the National Front from 1981 onward, the group became a reference point for far-right rock music under the banner Rock Against Communism. In this environment, the record label White Noise was created in 1982 to promote like-minded bands and expand the movement's influence through lyrics increasingly laden with racist messages and Nazi apologetics. This radical turn marked a new stage in the history of the skinhead movement, where music, violence, and extremist ideology converged into a social phenomenon that transcended British borders, leaving a disturbing mark on Europe's political and cultural imagination. The ideological radicalization of the skinhead movement during the 1980s brought about strong internal fragmentation. As a response to the rise of far-right rhetoric, opposing factions emerged within the movement itself, such as the Red Skins, identified by their leftist and anti-fascist positions. These groups promoted initiatives and collectives like Skins, Hate the NF, Anti-Nazi League, and Skinheads Against Racial Prejudices, SHARP, which openly stood against racism and the far right. Additionally, new identities appeared within skinhead culture, such as homoskins, members of the LGBTQ+ community, skin girls or Chelseas, women involved in the movement, and skin hooligans, strongly tied to the football scene. This ideological and personal diversity expanded the movement's boundaries beyond its initial image of homogeneity and violence. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the skinhead culture expanded significantly across Europe, increasingly revealing the ideological differences among its members. While some joined small communist or anarchist groups, many opted to become involved in established political parties, especially the Labour Party. The movement's evolution reflected growing polarization between those who embraced neo-fascist rhetoric and those who, from the same aesthetic and cultural background, completely rejected intolerance, racism, and discrimination, transforming the skinhead phenomenon into a symbolic battlefield between opposing worldviews. Today, the skin Nazi movement is fragmented into three main branches. The first, known as Hammerskin, maintains strong ties to urban violence and the most radical football environments. The second, Blood and Honor, is more musically oriented and exhibits a greater degree of politicization. The third, Volksfront, emerged in 1994 in the state of Oregon, USA. and combines organizational elements with a more structured ideological vision. Within this landscape, subdivisions have also proliferated based on particular interests or ideological leanings. For example, SXE skinheads follow a naturalistic and abstinent lifestyle, while hooligans channel their identity through football passion. In terms of doctrine, some adopt racial supremacy positions, others promote separatism, and some even fuse neo-Nazism with extremist trends like Satanism or certain radicalized Islamist views. The central message of contemporary skin Nazism revolves around a pan-European racism that exalts the supposed superiority of the so-called white race. Its members openly proclaim the existence of a Semitic conspiracy aimed at dissolving that identity through miscegenation and mass immigration. The rhetoric no longer seeks to construct a complex racial theory, but is reduced to slogans and catchphrases calling for direct action and the absolute rejection of ethnic diversity. Far from offering an ideological reinterpretation of old National Socialism, this new movement is based on a Manichaean view of the world, in which a white and pure Europe is constantly threatened by external enemies. The terrorism associated with the skin Nazi movement represents the violent manifestation of discourses promoted by the European far right after World War II too. While many of their actions may seem like mere acts of senseless vandalism, they are actually driven by a political logic, albeit disorganized, and are easily manipulated by extremist ideologies. This network of radicalized youth has managed to entrench itself in numerous European countries and also in North America. Far from being an isolated phenomenon, the skin Nazi movement has achieved a worrying international expansion. In the mid-1990s, the Anti-Defamation League in Washington released a report clearly reflecting this reality. In June 1995, over 70,000 skinheads were identified across 33 countries with strong organizational ties, many of which were maintained and reinforced through the internet, which was already becoming a key tool for spreading hate. In Germany, neo-Nazism encountered serious legal, political, and social obstacles from the outset that prevented it from taking root as a significant force. Nevertheless, various extremist expressions managed to keep the ideology alive at the margins. The first wave of neo-Nazism after World War II was characterized by systematic Holocaust denial. Authors like Thies Christopherson and Arthur Butz attempted to discredit the Jewish genocide, presenting it as a fabrication by international interests. These ideas found an audience among far-right circles outside Germany, especially in Argentina, Spain, and the United States, where publishing houses and distribution centers such as the Institute for Historical Review were born. Meanwhile, within Germany, laws strictly prohibited any glorification of Nazism, making public expression difficult. During the 1980s and 1990s, the skinhead movement offered a new platform for these radical ideas. Although not originally political, this youth subgroup became politicized, absorbing elements of neo-fascism. From there, violent factions like Hammerskin and Blood and Honor emerged, combining a cult of violence with overt racism. The expansion of the internet at the end of the 20th century allowed them to establish transnational networks, facilitating the coordination of acts, propaganda, and recruitment, often through music or football. Despite their political marginality, the threat of neo-Nazism never fully disappeared. In reunified Germany, rejection of immigration and refugees became a driving force behind extremist rhetoric. Attacks on foreigners, homosexuals, and other vulnerable groups multiplied in the 1990s, fueled by ideological voids and economic unrest in the eastern part of the country. However, German civil society and institutions responded forcefully. Educational campaigns, state surveillance, and judicial rulings have kept neo-Nazism under control, preventing it from regaining the prominence it once had.